tradition for next 45 minutes to an hour. Please, sir.
Welcome back. I'm going to continue in English again. During the question and answer session, among the students, if there are some who feel confident to ask questions in Tibetan, please do, okay? Now, this afternoon is more focused on, Buddhism, and particularly the unique features of it, and also the Tibetan tradition. This morning, we already had some discussions, conversations about the place of Buddhism within the overall conception of Tibetanness. Buddhism first came to Tibet in the 7th century, although Tibetan historians would say that some of the texts came as early as the 4th century. For example, Yumbulagar is the first fortress built in the 4th century, and during that king, Thupten, there are stories, some of them are legendary, where scriptures are supposed to come down from, falling down from the sky, from clouds. Whatever may be the case, probably the chances are the real story is that some text may have ended up in Tibet. And Thupten is said to have a dream in which it says that in 12 generations, the meaning of this text will be revealed. So that was the 7th century Songtsen Kapo. In any case, as I mentioned in my morning presentation, 7th century is really the time when Buddhism formally got established in Tibet, with the building of Phasa Chogang, installation of, there were 2 very important statues in Tibet, in fact 3 actually. One is the statue of the Buddha brought by Princess Wencheng as her dowry gift to Emperor Songtsen Gampo, which was originally housed in Ramoche temple and which was subsequently moved to Phasa Chogang. There was another statue of the Buddha brought by the Nepalese princess, which was initially installed in Orang, which then got moved back to Ramoche. So today, later the placement of these 2 statues was switched. Another important statue in Phasa Chogang is the Chenrese statue, which is known as the Ramjong Ngade. And this is a statue of Avalokiteshvara, which has another statue at its heart. So there are 2 statues. And then on top of that, according to the legend, when Songtsen Gampo died, he's supposed to have dissolved into the statue, and his 2 princesses, queens, are also said to have dissolved. So that's what makes the statue 5-faceted, Ramjong Ngade. Ramjong means self-arisen. It was not made by a human being. So in any case, those important statues really came to Tibet in the 7th century, and that's where the formal Buddhism began. The more systematic attempt at really institutionalizing Buddhism really came in the 8th century with Padmasambhava and Guru Rinpoche and the Shantarakshita coming in, bringing the monastic tradition, philosophical, teaching, a systematic translation of many of the Buddhist texts, which eventually became, compiled as Kangyur and Tengyur. So the actual compilation is in the 13th, 14th century, but the texts that were translated mainly in the 7th to the 9th century period. Okay, and they are later put together in 2 canonical collections. One is called Kangyur. Kangyur means literally translations of scriptures, the Buddha's words. Ka-gyur, Yur is translations. Kangyur means translations of Buddha's words. And the second collection is known as Tengyur, Tenju literally means translations of treatises. Ten refers to Tenju. Tenju is Shastras. So these are philosophical, important religious texts written by great Indian masters. So you have Tibetans have two canonical collections. I don't know if they're here, but they were somewhere in the main prayer hall. You have Kanyuru in one section, Tenju. So those systematic translations began in this, from the 8th century onwards. And over time, Buddhism really came to be established. Tibetan language, the written system was almost designed specifically to bring this new teaching from India. And that's one of the reasons why Tibetan translations of Sanskrit texts are very highly valued, because they are very accurate, unlike the translation of the Chinese. Because by the time Buddhism came to China, China already had a long history of written language-based, sophisticated philosophical culture, which meant when new texts were being brought in, the terminology had to fit into an already existing worldview and philosophical terminology. So Chinese Buddhist texts had to adapt their terminology, whereas in Buddhism, when it came to Tibet, we did not have a writing system-based culture, although there is an alternative view coming from the Buddha tradition, which makes the case that at least in the Shamshung area, which is in western Tibet, there was a writing system. That's still open to question. There's some scholars maintain that the actual writing system was based on the Shamshung text, script that existed before. But at this point, we don't have any archaeological evidence that points to the existence of a written language system prior to the 7th century. So it's an open question. I know some Tibetan scholars who are more nationalistic would like to argue that there was an indigenous writing system before the Indian script was brought in, but so far, no evidence. There's no carvings on the rocks, no scripts written on the bones, because in the old, ancient cultures and traditions and places, in the past they were writing things on slates and inscribing things on the wall, and if there was such a thing, we should be finding it, but maybe it will turn out. But at this point, it's an open question. So we will, I for one, accept that as far as the current writing system is concerned, it's 7th century. So anyway, the 7th century writing system and the grammar was brought from India, and the language was almost designed to bring, Indian Buddhist concepts. So that's why, almost all the words in Sanskrit were translated into Tibetan, except for a few words like lotus, Padma, because there was no lotus in Tibet. So Padma is the Sanskrit word, and in order to make it easier for the Tibetans, we call it Pema. We don't say Padma. And Singhi, there were no lions in Tibet, although we have 2 lions on our national flag, but those are mythological creatures, not real animals. So there were no lions in Tibet. Lions existed in India. So the Tibetan word Singhi is actually a modified word of Sanskrit word Sinha. And because Sinha is close to Tibetan, so we changed it. So in fact, there is a 9th century text, which is late 8th century, early 9th century text called Dajjapambanyiva, which is an amazing piece of writing as early as that period, which explains the translation theory and practice. When we bring Sanskrit text into Tibetan, and how there are certain words like lotus, Pema and Singhi, which should not be translated because they don't exist in Tibet. So then you might as well use the original term, but when you use the original term, it should be modified so that it's easier for the Tibetan tongue. So those are very impressive thinking behind all of this. So these are great innovative Tibetan kind of approach to bringing translations. So the translation took place over a long period of time, and by the end of the 8th century, thanks to Shantarakshita, already many of the philosophical literature was translated into Tibetan. Shantarakshita himself was a great Indian philosopher, not just of Buddhism, but in fact of general Indian systems of thought. His main text, called Tattva Samgraha, which is still available in Sanskrit, and in fact not just Buddhist, but in fact non-Buddhist Indian traditions also highly value that text as an encyclopedia of Indian philosophy. So this was the master who came to Tibet, and his student Shantarakshita came to Tibet. At that time there was a competition for dominance between two forms of Buddhism in Tibet, Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism, because Tibetan Empire had connections with China, Central Asia. There were Chinese Hashan monks coming into Tibet, and then you have the Indians coming in. Then of course you're among the ruling elite, you know, the members of the royal family and the other powerful, you know, ministers' families. Some of them were going with the Chinese side, some of them were going with the Indian side. Human beings are human beings, you know. There's going to be competition. So finally, King Chusong staged a very famous Samya debate, where he basically invited the two sides together and, you know, allowed them to engage in a series of debates, and whoever wins is going to be basically dictating the version of Buddhism that is going to be the official in Tibet. So at the end of these debates, the Indian side is supposed to have won, and then the Chinese Hashan and his students were asked to leave. And since then, and in fact we have a text that shows how immediately after the king issues a decree. He says, from now on, our version of Buddhism will be the following. The philosophical view will be that of Nagarjuna, and then the practices will be that of Mahayana Buddhism, 6 perfections. He actually sets up and that's when Buddhism became the official Tibetan state religion. So that was in the 8th century. And so, to cut a long story short, it is thanks to this particular debate and the Indian side, sort of winning the day, which really defined the Tibetan tradition. And this is why His Holiness always reminds us Tibetan Buddhist tradition is the Nalanda tradition. And the Nalanda tradition, what is the unique feature of Nalanda tradition is the emphasis on reason, not just faith. And emphasis on reason and practice of the Dharma based on understanding, grounded in the study of the great classics. So that really is the Nalanda approach. So the Nalanda approach does not emphasize devotion alone. And so if you now compare the Chinese tradition versus the Tibetan tradition, the Chinese tradition tends to be much more devotional. Worshipping Amitabha is a very important part of the focus. Chanting is a very important part of the focus. Even when they read scriptures, they tend to emphasize the sutras, the Buddha's words, not so much the shastras, the philosophical treatises. The Tibetan tradition is very different. Tibetan tradition, of course, emphasize devotion to the Buddha, taking refuge in all the rest. But when it comes to understanding the path to enlightenment, Tibetan tradition insists on the individual understanding the text, understanding the practice, and studying. So, and this is the system that was established in the 8th century, and since then it became the norm. Now, from this evolved the entire Tibetan tradition. Of course, today when we talk about Tibetan tradition, we talk about, Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, Gelug, and Chonang. But those labels, those different, schools were later inventions. When Buddhism first came to Tibet, in the 6th century, 7th century, established in the 8th century. There was no Nyingma Sakya Gyaluk. Okay? So basically it was Buddhism, Indian Buddhism. Now, with the Lang Dharma and the collapse of the empire, Central Empire, then Tibet became splintered, and there were many different kingdoms. And then during this period, there was a decline of Buddhism. Very few monks were seen in central Tibet. According to one estimate, it took almost 80 years before a monk was seen. So there were very few monks there, and a monastic establishment got declined. But to cut a long story short, in the middle of 11th century, so 10 something, Buddhism started getting revived in Tibet, and it began from Western Tibet and from Amdo as well. The monastic tradition revival came from Amdo area, central Tibet, and the main sort of revival came from Western Tibet, thanks to Atisha. So in the history of Tibetan Buddhism, Atisha, the Indian master from Bengal, is a very important figure. And Atisha's activity, he was in Tibet for nearly 13 years. Atisha's activities in Tibet led to the emergence of what is the first self-consciously identified school, Kadampas. Okay, Kadampas were the first self-consciously identified school. They were the followers of Atisha's teaching and his Tibetan spiritual heir, Jinpa. And then the term Nyingma came into being, because Nyingma means the old, and when you call something old, there has to be something new, because otherwise you cannot call something old. So all the traditions that came with Atisha and after Atisha are referred to as the Sarma, the new school. And those members who continue to have greater loyalty and allegiance to the imperial period Buddhism, period before Atisha, they came to be referred to as the Nyingmapas. Okay, so this is, and in the Tibetan tradition, when we talk about these four major traditions, the distinctions are not really about doctrinal issues. It's really more about allegiances and loyalty to a transmission, a lineage. Nyingmapas, the followers of Nyingma tradition, owe primary allegiance to the early Buddhism that came to Tibet, especially the teachings of Padmasambhava. So it's more a question of lineage and loyalty to a particular lineage. Kadampas were the ones who have deeper allegiance to Atisha and Jinpa and their teachings. Sakya tradition owes primary allegiance to a particular lineage that comes from Dromé Lotsawa and Sakya masters. So this is Lamdre and Hevacha Tantra. And then the Kagyu tradition came primarily through the allegiance belonging to the lineage of Marpa, Milarepa, and so on. And then the newest school is Gelug. Gelug is a kind of a new version of Kadamba and owes great primary allegiance to the teachings of Tsongkhapa. So the major schools of Tibetan Buddhism has more to do with transmission and lineage rather than different doctrinal positions. And all the four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism share common kind of, allegiance to the Indian tradition, the Nalanda tradition. Okay? So that I think is a broad understanding of Tibetan tradition, because sometimes the younger generation of Tibetan, when they're interested in Tibetan Buddhism, then they say, okay, where do I start? There's this thing, there's that thing, there's this thing. Where does Lamrim fit in? So I think it's helpful to have the big picture. Once you have a big picture, then you understand. And then you also need to understand what are the main contributions of some of the key figures. On your individual level, whether you see yourself as a Gelugpa or Sakyapa or Nyingmapa and so on. For the younger generation, it's not really an issue. For the elder generation, it may be an issue. But for the younger generation, it's not really an issue. We're now living in a much more integrated Tibetan community where you have access to all the traditions. And this is why, following His Holiness's vision is a really good one, which is basically, when he gives teachings, he presents the shared common Tibetan tradition which comes from India. And that, I think, is really a good way of relating to the teachings. So, what is important as Tibetans, regardless of whether your parents are Sakyapa or Nyingma or Kagyu or Gelugpa, as a Tibetan, educated young Tibetan, taking interest in Buddhism, what is important is to at least have some idea of the key figures, individuals. So I spoke about Shantarakshita, I spoke about Padmasambhava, I spoke about Kamalashila. Then you have major figures like Morvaneshwara. Morvaneshwara was late 11th, early 12th century Tibetan thinker who spent a lot of time in India and Kashmir studying Sanskrit. He, from a Tibetan historical point of view, what makes him unique is that he is the founder of Tibetan scholastic tradition. The study of the great classics in Tibet, systematic study, is really Morvaneshwara. And he also invented a very important system that the Tibetans are very good at, which is a template system. So when Tibetans, some of you, if you're working in modern setting, sometimes when you do PowerPoints, you do outlines, and then from the outlines you go deeper into different levels of category. This is called the subject system in Tibetan, and it was Morvaneshwara who invented that. So many of the Tibetan texts has this very impressive outline system that goes into different levels of depth. So Morvaneshwara is one important figure that individuals need to know, because he really is the father of Tibetan scholastic tradition. Another person that we need to know is Chapa Chögyal. He is late 12th century. He is the one who started the debate, invented the Tibetan debate tradition. And Tibetan debate tradition, although is based on Nalanda Buddhist texts and logic and epistemology, but the form itself is uniquely Tibetan. And it uses very Tibetan terminology, style of debating, and many of you would have seen monks debating in the courtyard with all the kind of boisterous physical posture, shouting, jumping. This is Chapa Chögyal. And he was a genius. And in fact, there is even some Western thinkers believe that when it comes to systematic definition of definition itself, Chapa Chögyal may have been the first person in the world to write about it. So Chapa is another intellectual giant that you need to know. And another important person is Sakya Pandita. For late 13th century, early 13th century. Sakya Pandita is the one who really changed Tibetan high culture, poetry, literary tradition. And also, he was very innovative. He, in fact, wrote even a treatise on music, a formal treatise on music. He was the one who brought to Tibet and invented the Lekshe literature. Some of you might have known Sakya Lekshe. Have you heard of Sakya Lekshe? Sakya Lekshe. Those are things I think the teachers need to teach actually at the Sunday classes once in a while. The teachers are here. I would really appeal to you respectfully. A few words from Sakya Lekshe. In the old days, every educated Tibetan would know many verses from Sakya Lekshe. Jeshe is a really beautiful text, and it's modeled on Indian Niti Shastra, such as Panchatantra. You have heard of Panchatantra. Now, Panchatantra is the famous Indian animal story book, where within a story there's a moral, and it's a sort of a particular pedagogical method in classical India, which was used to train the princesses and children of the high ministers, was through telling of stories. So Sakya Pandita brought this literature into Tibet and wrote the first text called Sakya Jeshe, which then opened up a whole genre of writing called Chui Tenjue, treatises on water, treatises on trees, and so on. Sakya Pandita also brought Indian Sanskrit poetry into Tibet. Today's beautiful poetry writing was brought to Tibet by Sakya Pandita using Sanskrit poetics. And Sanskrit poetics is very sophisticated, and a main emphasis on learning how to use metaphors. And there are actually over 30 different ways in which systematically you could use the metaphor differently. So it's called Gengen or Beken. Sakya Pandita is the one that brought it in. And Sakya Pandita finally is the one who systematized the knowledge discipline division of Rime Chewanga and Chuanga. There's 5 major fields of knowledge and 5 minor fields of knowledge. So this is Sakya Pandita who formally introduced the systematic training of this in Tibet. So if there is one person who is the most important figure in the entire history of classical Tibetan knowledge, it has to be Sakya Pandita. He's that important. So if you guys are Tibetan and interested in Tibetan culture, Tibetan history, Tibetan philosophy, and if you don't know who Sakya Pandita is, there's a big gap in your knowledge, okay? And this is partly our own fault, because the Tibetan exile community also have not been sophisticated enough to develop pedagogy material that would make these important figures come to life. Whereas in the West, every high school student will know who Shakespeare is. Okay? Most high school students will know who Mozart is, because they are so important cultural figures in Western cultural imagination that everybody will kind of know who they are, broadly, not necessarily, completely. But in Tibetan, we have failed to find a way to communicate to our younger generation, to say who the major cultural icons are. We have Buddha, we have the great Dalai Lamas, but beyond that, when it comes to culture, on religion maybe we can say a few words, a few people, but when it comes to culture, we really don't have. So I think it's important to have some understanding, who these figures are. Then of course you have Jinpa, who was the great, the greatest writer in Jinpa tradition, and then Gampopa was the founder of the Kagyu tradition. And many of you probably know the story of Milarepa because it's an exciting story. There's a drama there. So these are important cultural figures that those who are interested in Tibetan tradition need to know. Now, while we know these stories, which is important because they are the ones who make the idea of Tibetan Buddhism real. Because otherwise it becomes abstract. It becomes a list. And you don't want your understanding of Tibetan tradition just reduced to a list. You want some flesh and bones to that imagination who these great beings were. So I think it's important, and those who are interested, fortunately the new material is coming. Shambhala is publishing a series called Tibetan Masters, and these are deliberately being written in a non-academic way for the benefit of general readership. So I think you should watch out for it. I'm about to submit my manuscript on the life of Tsongkhapa, which is going to be published next year, because next year is the 600th anniversary of Tsongkhapa's Nirvana. So I think more and more of this literature is going to come out, and I think it is important that, and when you read a biography, it's also not that difficult, you know, because there's a story, there's a person behind it. So it is important to have that kind of, you know, understanding. Now, with respect to studying Buddhism itself, His Holiness really wishes that his Tibetan community, particularly the younger generation, the educated ones, find a way to engage with Buddhism in an intelligent, informed, educated way. What does that mean? That means being able to do some study. Okay? So you can choose to study, first have a very general introduction to Buddhism, and then maybe you should choose a text, like there are now beautiful translations of Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara. So you can choose a text like the English translation of Shantideva and systematically study it. And one of the things that he has suggested is that Tibetan community members form reading groups and look at a text and bring up questions and discuss. So this is what he means by relating. And one of the things that he really wished the Tibetan community will pick up is a series of 4 books that His Holiness has envisioned, and which is being done by a team of scholars. And these are known as Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. The Tibetan version of the 2 volumes are already out. The 2 on science, 1 on physical science and 1 on mind science are already out. This is the first volume of the English. Second volume is going to come out soon. Volume 3 and 4 are on philosophy. The Tibetan version is being finalized, the translations will come out. So these are specially designed for educated readers who need not have formal background in monastic training, but who are interested, who are willing to spend some time, and who are willing to put some effort, and has the intellectual capacity to do so, to be able to really go through the key topics in a systematic way. So this particular one is on the Buddhist conception of material world, and it includes also some basics of Buddhist methodology of how, from a Buddhist point of view, when we try to understand the physical world, what kind of methodology we use. So I'm going to leave this copy here for the association. I'm sure the association library has one. And the paperback has just come out in India, which is very affordable. I think it's really worth, you may not be able to read it cover to cover because a lot of the texts are direct quotation from classical texts which are translated, but there are introductions and essays which go with them, which will really give you a sense of the importance. So I think to conclude, what I want to say is to really underline the aspiration that His Holiness has, that, I remember quite recently at one of the interviews, a question was asked about the long-term survival of Buddhism in this modern age, the digital age, and His Holiness gave a very, very powerful response. And he said that if the Buddhist community continues to engage with their Dharma, their tradition, purely on the basis of devotion, he said, I'm not quite sure how long it will last. But on the other hand, if the traditional Buddhist community find a way to engage with their Buddhist faith in a much more educated, reason-based, way, then Buddhism will remain for centuries to come. That, I think, is a powerful wisdom, and this is what he wishes for us Tibetans. And at the end of the day, His Holiness has always reminded us that those who are able to learn something from Buddhism themselves, apply it in their daily life, they themselves stand to gain. Because in your day-to-day life, you will have more resources to deal with stress, you will have a better worldview, because in the end, your worldview matters. You know, how you see the world. If you see the world as dangerous, everybody's out there to screw you, you know, then of course, you're going to live in the world out of terror and suspicion and fear. Whereas if you generally have a disposition that says, okay, all people have basic compassionate nature, everybody will try hard, sometimes there may be difficulties, but then that's life. That kind of perception of the world completely changes the way you live. You may be living in exactly the same environment. Two different people with two different views experiences the world differently. And this is where Buddhism is really powerful. In my own day-to-day life, I end up leading a life that is pretty busy. You know, I travel a lot and I'm connected with all sorts of, stuff, work, Stanford, minor life, McGill, my own classics text work, and then some work in India. There's a lot of it, and I interact with many different people, and when I bring a simple, kind of clear attitude, I don't find much stress, because in the end, why be afraid? Everybody's like me. I know at the end of the day, everybody wants to be happy. Nobody wants to have problems. Those are very simple, basic ideas which really make a difference. And the Lojong teachings, and this is where I think the younger generation, if you take, there's a particular genre of text called Lojong, mind training. Wisdom has produced a paperback version called Essential Mind Training. The beauty of Lojong is Lojong makes practical the insights and wisdom of Buddhism that you can apply on a daily basis. That when you are confronted with challenges, difficulties, when you are dealing with difficult people, all of this, Lojong really teaches you how to maintain your resilience, how to maintain your optimism. And in the end, while you are seeking to the path to enlightenment on a day-to-day life, if you can also live a happier life, you stand to gain. And everybody wants that. So I think, although there is a powerful argument that the younger generation of Tibetans should take Buddhism seriously because it is part of our heritage, which is a broader cultural argument, the most compelling argument in the end is it's beneficial to you. You are the first one to gain benefit from your understanding and experience of Buddhism. And that is, in a sense, the most powerful argument. Because one of the things that the West, the modern West, is struggling with is how to give individuals a sense of purpose and a meaning in a world that is secularized, a world that is pluralistic. Now, people sometimes, because of that, go to extreme form of religion, fanaticism. Some go to the other extreme of not taking any interest in spirituality and being completely materialistic. But Buddhism offers this beautiful middle way, where you are not dogmatic religious, but you also are deeply spiritual, and where you have a sense of purpose and meaning that makes your life, meaningful and rich. And this is where the power of Buddhism comes in. I think for me, personally, the most compelling argument is you should take Buddhism seriously because you stand to gain. And on top of that, of course, if we care about the survival of Tibetan cause and Tibetan culture and language and so on, then taking interest in Buddhism has also another dimension. So that's what I wanted to share. So maybe we can have some question and answers. Yeah. Yes. Maksudnya di ada di 무유인데 야 남쪽 거리가 이 차상마신이 된다는 표현은 도대체 가시고 싶다는데但你无缘但是남쪽 등에在我这学的남쪽通往표현을 그랬을 말이다. 라고도 그 나오야 직접으로 직관하고 나신 게 도요를 주디 나는데 아니 주주에 스카나미 거래 나는데 주주 투모만이다. 다 같이 나보다 같이 스카나 거에디 도요야 주로 고베 나무 개베 나무야 주주신에 같이 장안에 나주다 장안에 나주 이보로야 지 제대로 지역의 인상 하나 주제 주선의 생각이야 아니 상해야 저거 주니 이 자의 하상이 좋지다 순환의 자아의 개발 강화의 시간 상당한 시대 시간으로 로마 강화의 시대 초 로마의 저 하나 대지제 근데 저거 주니 판동으로데 근데 강화의 시대 초에 제가 통제 되는 수원에 있는 교육의 남주지 자아의 남주지 지오레스 근데 따와 자시하는 공부도 따와 제 저거 바로 지금 두제 대과 친구들 양에 상하는 제 어떤 지리지 때 하다 자아게 남주 지만 시지 그런데 근데 상가라시다 하다 자아를 떠주면 개버치고 남배 개버 좀 마세요 참말을 개버래 고랑은 대고는 유튜브 샤샤는 다들 주주의 자아 개버도 보존체다 제시물을 드림이 하다 지금 남주진에게 벤진 배트도 지금 그 대체 그 나오야 흉칭으로 제 시로 띵난 거와 아니 디는자 내가 지주지 슈고도 가르치면은 지단 교육이 주주 나오야 사장님 막가 유튜브 시제 전화가 제가 실수요도 요래 이내 지금 슈머쪽이 파마쪽 주로 가리네 매네 슈머쪽은 그 집에 돈에 남바 아주 그 가다지 교육은 내에서 지성을 땅토를 야고요 다시 성 땅거리야 아니 우주기 차네 교육은 되냐 하나 그린 치슈 제제제 근데 개하고 수지 많은데 왜 가시 좀 문제점도 나고요 그러나 자세하는 뭐로 내셔라기 하나 교육이 흉치모 제가 좀 해야 될 우주를 흉 가다 대조 좀 해가 sabject 하면데 오늘 내셔라고 써요 두지때 제제점을 잡아주고 생기기 빡세 방향이 신이 것이 별거라는 돈이야 시험 축구하는데 잡아주고 있으면서요 그래 그는 이제 작품을 사면 자샤야 되는다 교육이 체류를 내야 같은 치쇼 차대요 리네 처음마다 총원만 써야 돼 작품을 사면 그래야 되는 방법에 야간에서 영암의 몸에 목수육이 영암 세통자에게 수요들을 매년에 작품을 사면에 하다니 야학이 누구 된줄이야 뺄랑제 사제들이 사제들 시에 좀제 그 나오냐 렉시에게 된줄 추도식이 된줄다 너무 다해야지 나가 고치는 사제들이 생활을 왜 더 자셔야 되나 생활을 등성제 간다 그 간다지 초놈이야 현장 파생하니 얼마 된줄이다 사제들 좀제 그 나오냐 다 간다 지금 야학을 나타 샤스트라서 영화가 흉이야 빼자지 얼마 된줄이게 좀제 다 별 나오냐 별개가 나오냐 의심 세토고 갖다 지금 이 의심 세토고 중요해요. 이게 때문에 그 세토고 뭐에 소연진에서 자본 사면 자료 먼저 갖다 그 인생에서 자본 사면 수로서 두고 때듯이 모신이 없어. 수주 사제 이만 이게 제일 많다. 수주 사제가 이만 이게 계제고 되어버려요. 근데 그거 있잖아요. 자본 사면서 가지고 뭐 이제 잘 주지 야 니들 제대로 다 somos entonces me marcó dos pensando no jogo pela 지금 라브다 지금 라브 트랜스 한지 자셔야 되나 망치기 셰익스피어 소리에서는 멋있는 거 여러 종이 좀 들어가지 그래 모차르트 소리에서는 이 하다 뭐 개발치고 있고 근데 no jogo 지소 리슈리아 제제제 밉들이 그런 건지 질문으로 틀리고 멋있는 거와 아주 배워서 우리 중에 콜레지 tempor에 알아서 배우기 수유를 쇼리아 제제제 맨날 수요를 써도 좀 상보를 좀 만들고 담에게 했습니다. 그러니까 이 먼저 때에서 말아서 지속을 통해 당기려 봐요. 아주 탭소도 나와. 탭소도. 근데 이 돈에 만들게 되고 쇼가서 등산 이제 나오고 이상 이렇게 저도 때 돈한테 지금 교육을 남주에서 들어가야 지금 분당 상만지 가서 차종 주요지 차 투배나 시안 남주에서 들어가야 토를 시작제 subject del theory, toso cha devena, and susu yongso to na ko de cha marwa. Then Jesongo the Chimusla, and Jesongo the Chimus, the Jekari maybe, or China, and Jesongo Chimu, which heavy in Swab Rajore. Jesongo Chimusa, I'm sure Yembe, yeah, did the chair doesn't Lord Chadova. It's written the young Rato, Shomas did not, the main issue. And it Kata Tano from the Lekamunzi, Turelia, Chipava Shobato, Shew, the Tone, and Bella, the Page, and Namju, Tebayang, Tone, Chumayimba, Namju, Page. 나중 남는지 나중 고도 요래지 고시도 투르는 게 이제 대체가 나한테 쇼도 좀에 뭐 고정 전화 못도 되고 봐. 오늘 제고 그래서 좀 다등산 야하게 쇼도 주주 시험을 방법이 이제나 요래. 아니 비유나 공주도 내면 이제나 뭐셔야 되나? 이제나네 곧 강강 장애가. 그래서 제일 통 수수로제대 한 타동 그러는데 먼저 남주 개침벌에 남주에 돈을 제고 써야 돼. 나중 먼저 배우를 좀 자시에 때 많이 받치고 때 먼저 배워야 되는 게 지고 많이 봐. 뒤에 개도 친구래. 한동 로봇이 수수 대로 돈에 계산해. 나중 로존체, 나중 양면체, 나중 고도 레벨은 니리 미지게 나리야 상당당다. 구상 구양다. 강연체가 강연치다나. 뭔가지 돈에 수수 계산 요인상 한동데 나중 돈나 제가 계산 수수로. 근데 양 먼저 생애 이슈에 단대 연구위원회 남주고 이제 제가 다시 배셔야 이제나 많이 힘들어. 야, 그 개나서 투지.
We will just right away move on to the question and answer session. If we have any questions from the participants and then also from the community members, I would like to welcome the questions. At the same time, participants are all the time encouraged to speak in Tibetan if they feel more comfortable in Tibetan language. Whichever language you feel more comfortable in, please put your question in that language.
The first question was that you know, we are all aware that you know, Buddhism has very many unique features, such as its philosophy, concept of karma, philosophy of emptiness, and the mind science and so on. So, and there's a lot of potential for entering into dialogue with Western thought and Western philosophy. So, when you enter into a conversation with Western philosophy, what would be the best approach to bring it systematically so that you can further the conversation? So that was one question. Second question was, you know, you spoke about these 4 volumes that His Holiness has envisioned on science and philosophy, the Indian Buddhist classics. Can you explain a little bit about the broad thinking behind the way in which the topics are organized in those 4 volumes? So those were the 2 questions, okay? And I'm going to respond in Oh, okay. So now that the question has been translated to English, I'll now respond in English, okay? The first question really has to do with skillful means in which you can enter into a conversation with, Western philosophy. Because if you right from the beginning bring the concept of rebirth and karma, the conversation kind of ends there. Because science, for one, doesn't accept the concept of rebirth or karma. The karma is a causation across this lifetime. That's a broad way of looking at karma. So then, I think, as you can see in Mind and Life dialogues, we had recently the 33rd one in Dharamsala at His Holiness's residence in the temple. One thing that you will notice is that in Mind and Life dialogues, the topics for conversation are always areas of common interest. So, whether it is the nature of experience, whether it is understanding how attention works, all of this. So the topics are topics of mutual interest, which then opens up a conversation where perspectives from the Buddhism and perspectives from modern science and Western philosophy can be brought in. So that's, I think, a much more creative way of engaging the dialogue. And one of the ideas behind Mind and Life dialogue is right from the beginning, because I have been part of this right from the start, from 1980. The first dialogue was in 1987. We were very conscious in developing the model for dialogue. Because normally science is very hegemonic, science is very dominant. When science gets into a conversation, it tends to dictate its own terms and subsume whatever it is studying. So science becomes the method of studying, and the other discipline becomes an object of study. So right from the beginning, we were very conscious of avoiding that. We wanted to create a platform, we meaning His Holiness, primarily because he's the main founder of Mind and Life dialogue. We wanted to create a platform where the Buddhist perspectives and the scientific perspectives will both have equal level of voice, and both sides will avoid attempting to reduce the other one into its framework. So there's genuine respect. There is also a humility, because often scientists don't have humility. They come with the assumption that any knowledge that is coming from other sources are somehow secondary. The real knowledge is the one that comes from science. So in the dialogue, we seek out scientists who have a degree of humility, who at least acknowledge the possibility of knowledge coming from other sources than science. Okay? So those are deliberate choices that you make, which then allows a really good platform where you can have dialogue. And then the end result is, the results of the dialogue really promote the shared agenda, the shared goals. So that's why Mind and Life dialogues are very powerful, because they really create opportunities where dialogues happen with both sides, maintaining the integrity of their own discipline. Scientists don't become Buddhists and say, I believe X, Y, and Z. Buddhists don't give up the Buddhist framework. They're open. There's a genuine respect for integrity of both sides, but then they promote this common conversation. So that, I think, is a good model. So that's probably one area where you can look at. The second one it will take a lot more time to explain the thinking behind the way in which the topics are organized. But to cut a long story short, His Holiness's vision is the following. We have over 300 volumes of canonical texts, just over 100 in Kaindu, and over 225, 26 in Tengu. And in all of these texts, particularly the Tengu, His Holiness's view is that the subject matter of these texts can be categorized into three different classes. One is science, understanding of the natural world. Second is philosophy, which is more to do with interpretation of that understanding and coming up with a worldview. And third is religious practice. So his thinking is that the religious practice side is very specific to Buddhist, but the philosophy and the nature of reality understanding should really be part of common knowledge. The fact that they happen to be in Buddhist text is more of a coincidence of history, and these are great Buddhist masters who have come up with these ideas. But in the ideas themselves, there is nothing uniquely about religious. So, whether it is an understanding of the evolution of the cosmos, or the nature of the atomic structure of matter, or whatever it is, there is nothing religious about them. And his hope is to make these first two topics, the understanding of the natural world, which could be called Buddhist science, and philosophy, more accessible and available to the larger world. Now, in order to do that, you need a team of scholars who will look through this entire body of 2,200 and something volumes and seek out those aspects of science, those aspects of philosophy, and put them together in a structure that makes sense. And that's what it is. The first volume is on the physical world. Second volume is on nature of mind, or mind science. So the first two volumes are science. Third volume is on systems of philosophy in India, Thupten. And the final volume is more specifically Buddhist philosophical views on important themes. So and then His Holiness's hope is that by the end of studying all these 4 volumes, the person who is studying will have a very sophisticated understanding of the Buddhist worldview. Yeah?
Thank you. Next question, please.
There was, yeah.
Hello. distraction generation technology now component ideas 라면다요에 이 지금 주제 통화 라는가 상관이지 오신도 외도 지금 라도 아니 방마양전에 예를 우라 지마타비라 그래서 간절로 같이고 그래서 이 주제를 좀 간절로 보내 스트레스지 이거 공부를 나라니 아니 이 distraction 먹고 이제 클래리티 먹고요 clarity 그게 스스로 나오라서 아니 충분히 하고야 clarity보다 clarity면 아니 제가 잘하시는 졸라보다 오늘 밤 먼저라에 파라나에 이처럼 clarity 관계 미치고 있네 clarity면 아주 intentionally 오늘 you like that 네가 남출장도 도움을 가지고 얘도 쓰는 남출장이 나랑 그래서 나랑 나랑 감기가 많이 먹었어. 그래서 많이 충분히 수수 추로라 따뜻한 추로라 테크놀로지가 시작 디스트랙션이라 수수 나무라 그러다. 수수 나무라 그러면 나무 소화 나무라 그게 메시지 주어야 가지고 그 많이 있습니다. 아니 가시도 이게 디스트랙션 방탄에 나무라 주투면 아니 우리가 하시라. 그 하고 라스트 라이브 많이 주면 그래서 난 추천하는 그런 도움을 줘라 디지털하면서
You want to say sum up your question in English for the benefit of some of your colleagues? Just the essence.
So I was talking about how our generation is really strong distracted. We don't even know that we're so distracted. There are so much forces out there, like the technology, and also for the poor like parents who are doing their best to kind of like help us to teach us who we are and give us the tool that some of the ancient scholars that have worked so hard in terms of teaching us like the essence of Buddhism. But I think that we all know the benefit of Buddhism. It gives the peace of mind. But there's so much other distraction and clutter that it's so hard to kind of make that intention, like what's important in your life. Why is Buddhism really important? Like those. So basically, my question was to how can you give us the guidance as an individual and for the parents to give some clarity to help us have that, to develop that strong intention.
I think you really shared something that is very important, that you began to find the value in Buddhism when you had an adversity in your life, which then left very little room for distraction, but then it had the side effect of making you look deeper into yourself. I think that's a beautiful story. I think that in the end sums up what needs to be done if you want to take seriously the insights of Buddhism. Finding clarity, I think in the Tibetan tradition, there is a practice called kunonchoba, setting your intention. So setting your intention is supposed to be done in the morning, okay? And setting your intention has two roles. One is to help you connect consciously with your deeper aspirations. Because normally, many of us have aspirations, or at least like to have good aspirations, but we don't think about them, and then they remain dormant, and then they don't play much role in our everyday life. So the intention setting practice allows us to connect with our aspirations. So if we care about compassion, if we care about being good, if we care about being less angry, if we care about being more mindful, if we care about helping others. So these are important aspirations that you have. So what you do is you connect with them consciously. The other role in intention setting is to choose a specific task for the day. So if you happen to be, for example, if you had a disappointment in your mark or an exam, or if you desperately wanted to get this particular job, you have so much expectation, but you didn't get it, it's going to be disappointing to anyone. So then, if it lingers on for days, it can be corrosive. So what you could do is, as part of your intention, you will say, okay, I'm going to confront this. I'm going to deal with this. So you set a conscious intention to do a specific thing. And then at the end of the day, you quickly review your day to see if there's a connection. That's one thing that can really help bring clarity. And sometimes, in a difficult situation, one thing that helps bring clarity is to say, what is the most compassionate thing to do here? By simply asking that question, it brings a clarity. Because often, a lot of our problems are compounded because we lump everything together, and a specific problem becomes this enormous stress where we have X, Y, and Z. Asking the simple question, what is the most compassionate thing to do here, has this ability to bring clarity. And then along with compassion, you also need to bring wisdom, because sometimes compassionate kunlong or motivation alone is not enough. How you translate that kunlong motivation into action depends on wisdom. Because sometimes you may be very well intentioned, but you might end up doing more harm than good. And this is where wisdom is important. So this is why Tibetan tradition or Indian Tibetan tradition insists on the union of Thupten, compassion and wisdom or method of wisdom. So those are, but there is a bigger question which you raised, which you were not very specific, but because you asked me that question earlier separately, I know what that question is. The question is, when someone gets interested, how do they start? Where do they start? That is a difficult question because, you know, in Tibetan tradition we have 225 volumes of Tenju and 100 and something volumes of Kanju, and you know, the collected writings of the great masters like Tsongkhapa alone has 19 volumes, Thupten has 27 volumes. I mean, where do you start? That I think is that's an important question. And here, I think probably the best place to start is His Holiness's talks. You know, you should look at some of the teachings that he gives, and especially the teachings that he gives in the West, tends to, Buddhist teachings I'm talking about, not the general talk, I'm talking about his Buddhist teachings in the West, generally tend to have a very broad overview and introduction to Buddhism at the beginning, generally about an hour long. And that, having that big picture, and then looking at the specifics. For example, you can decide to spend maybe a whole month, you know, every week or every day, 10 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is, to say, okay, this time I'm going to focus on teachings on compassion and bodhicitta. So you're doing other practices, but your main focus is on understanding Nyingji Chenpo, Nyingji Chenpo Nyamlen, and Chanju Gesen, and you read about this, you listen to the teachings that are on that, you know, Lojong teachings. And then you can choose one time, you know, I'm going to focus now on understanding Myomon, the emotions that are causing so much problem. So then the Buddhist teachings on problems of emotion, how can you become more aware, and so on and so forth. So you can choose, you choose the topic yourself, okay? Then you look for the resources. That's probably one way of doing it. But it's a very untraditional way, I admit, but that's probably a more practical way of doing it. But you start with the big picture that His Holiness gives.
I was just wondering, it ties to this morning's talk on Tibetan identity and culture. So there's like this quotation by Dr.Jeshe, where he says a beautiful country is like a dreamlike illusion, and that unless your inner mental fictions are controlled, then strife with outer enemies will never end. And so when I read about these quotes and I read about impermanence, because then I have conflicting feelings with, Peba culture, Peba identity, and then Buddhism is like, no, you don't detach from that, and like, so about impermanence. So then, how do you resolve this conflicting thoughts and ideas?
That's actually, you tend to ask very tough questions actually. No, this is a very important question because sometimes there is a danger because of the teaching on impermanence and emptiness. There's a danger for someone to say, well, in the end nothing matters, everything is empty. So that kind of dismissive strain could come in. And this is why it's very important to understand, you know, for example, like the illusion-like nature of reality presupposes your understanding of emptiness. And your understanding of emptiness requires maintaining a fine balance between respect for a robust reality that is part of your everyday experience, and at the same time not clinging to it. Because generally clinging is what gives rise to all the problems. You know, when we're too attached to the idea of me, then everything that is seen as threat to that me, you want to find out. Okay? So this clinging is what gives rise to emotions and so on. So the idea is to have a view of reality without too much clinging and attachment, grasping. And that's a tough one. And those kind of things one will get there only much later. Because you do want to maintain a balance. And that's why the teaching on emptiness requires a lot of study, a lot of reflection, a lot of practice, and then, there's a beautiful, the same question is raised in Shantideva's text, where he raises the question and says, well, if everything is illusion-like, why bother seeking enlightenment? He says, why bother creating good karma? The question is raised. And he says, just as in a dream, when you experience that dream, you face tragedy. In the dream, the feeling of sadness that you experience is as real as in real life. Okay? So you had a dream tragedy, you have a dream, mourning, and both of them are equally valid. So in the same way, even though in the end you shouldn't cling to anything, but in an illusion-like world, there are also good and bad. So in the illusion world, there is also Tibetan identity. So I think it's a complicated question, but I think this is why sometimes there is a tension in the place of Buddhism in a nationalism-based identity. Because Buddhism is more universalist, it tends to pull us in all sentient beings' direction, which then has the implication of why should you be particularly attached to a particular identity. But on the other hand, we are human beings. We have our own personal identity. Being a Tibetan doesn't matter. We care for the cause of Tibet. We care for what happens to our brothers and sisters in the plateau of Tibet. So those are, again, part of who we are. So I think it's a tension, but I wouldn't say it's a contradictory tension. It's a tension which needs to be maintained in a healthy way so that we continue to benefit from the insights and teachings of Buddhism without undermining our commitment and dedication to the cause on this side. So it's a tough one, I admit.
I have a question here.
ये जगह दिक्कत कर रही है दिक्कत वाला शी संभा जुआ था तो भी संभलेगा तब पहना चाहे ना लीचिकी तो किसी ना होता सेगा रोशलियर सेगा किसी तो नॉन ये पात मिडी पास से है तो दिल दिक्कत संगे ना ये हो रही है सोना self defense संगे होगी
The question was in Buddhism, in the concept of karma. In order to fully accumulate the karma, there are certain factors. Kanda karki sevada, ji lebo thamuji kone sevada, panamo su seva yudivalya, su sungyo kata shenam tana pase niche, dibu chijupi keba yore. Na tu chimbu tone chebe ne keba shenrowa, kanda ji dima tanda karki sevada, kadu de lunga seva niche, na kadu de lunga seva, chimbu tone nyeka chunga zigorwa. Tadina shen, ana de leje le jung prodan jibar le jung prodan ya kamone chashi dingje ani sevada kadu de yen chen sevje chana dibo chim kewa yo taine seve dibo ta inta da ji so jwe dibo chazang yu yu men mishin kan ne sa sa lu shu de ya todu bu yo na ta yan sa sa lu shu yi tsma ke su na todu bu ta sa sa lu shu de yi tsma ma ke su na ke su pe sa sa dong ji ke ke be na yan anamo misele dibo chazang legi yo ma aine le jungje gi rodan di le khande sa yu me chichung ka zo yu me di ti shi bu chi no so bu shi ro din za le de ge nam sha ta shi cha ba le de ga tam she chen ba ma ne ken se we dis ju ma zo di de shung de ne sum ju be ga da ya ji ma ji bo zo ge je na je bo ta zo ya ka pe de ani chu mo ba 공동이 대주들이들이야 바보장 배양 차서로서 주주제스 nên 도대 공동이나 안상계대 자주성으로 차서로서 제스 두엔되는 공동이나 탐재 전략을 차서로서 제스 두어들 에틱스가 랑도다 레크되고 근데 이거 인생에서는 렌제가 남자 타신 차와 14불간 내리가는 탐재 전략과도 아주 미규모 지금 남주 주주제제 초반 챕터를 말해 디자 디베남샤티기 이내지랑 고노다 데부터는 디고 지금 그런 데는 저 저는 추주 현다 나로 양양 self-defense kitone save and go mara la gudwa and number and chigo mare number same issue with the same round.
We have our last question from him.
Okay, so first of all, I just want to say thank you for coming and giving this teaching. So language and culture are always evolving and changing. With that in mind, where do you see us in 100 years or so with all the outside influence of other different cultures? Do you think we might lose our identity, and are you optimistic about this?
That's a very, very good question, actually. The language and cultures always change. In fact, those that don't change tend to die out, actually. That's the nature of things. This is one of the reasons why His Holiness has always advised us that we should not be dogmatic in sticking to tradition and customs, everything. He says that unless the culture is able to adapt to the modern environment while recognizing a core, element that needs to be constant, if we are not able to make that distinction between customs that can be modified and cultural core that cannot be modified, we are not going to survive. So I think His Holiness is absolutely right. And this is what we see also in the biological world as well. In organisms that cannot adapt to a modern environment die out. And organisms that maintain some kind of constant core but adapt to the environment and periphery tends to adapt and survive. So I agree that cultures and language will change. And language, for example, like Tibetan has, according to Jinpa, in the early days, we were pronouncing all the samburangus and in fact the superscripts, the letter you put on the top. And in fact, you can see some evidence of that. For example, in Ladakh, they call Choston, children is Choston, Cham or Chosa, so sa is pronounced, and Thupten with a satata is pronounced. So Jinpa's argument is that in the old days we were pronouncing all the superscripts, but now we don't pronounce it. And he may be right. But in any case, languages do change. But my own sense is that Tibetan speaking world and Tibetan cultural sphere is large enough, although population-wise we are not that big, but area-wise we are quite big. And our cultural footprint is very large because of our Tibetan tradition and the language being the custodian of the Nalanda, knowledge heritage. Our cultural footprint is very large, disproportionately large based on the number of people that are involved. And if you look at the Tibetan books that are written by Tibetan masters throughout centuries, for the size of the population, the amount of books that have been written by Tibetan is just massive. You're talking about tens of thousands. So I think Tibetan language will remain. I'm confident. How expansive, I don't know. I don't think Tibetan language has the chance to become a global language because it's just too difficult. And for that matter, I don't think Chinese will become ever global language because the Chinese writing system is too complicated to be adopted by foreigners. English became global language because the English writing system is very efficient and very versatile. It's alphabet-based. But I think Tibetan language will remain, and also Tibetan culture will remain, because there is a value in Tibetan culture for the larger world. So I'm quite confident that our culture and our language will remain a couple of 100 years at least.
We still have 8 minutes to 3:30. I think we can squeeze in one last question.
Yeah.
Hello? I would like to talk about a very serious topic, and it's about self-mutilation. What are your thoughts about it? And also, I have another question after that. What are your thoughts about people calling the power couple? They get the drone and praise about self-realization.
Self-realization. And what's the
Very
second
tough
one?
about it.
What is the second one?
And the second one is people call them after whatever happens. People call them power and power. They get praised.
Okay.
What are you talking about that?
Yeah. That's actually a very, very painful. I feel very conflicted about the whole matter. As a Tibetan, I feel deeply for the individuals themselves and the families of those individuals. And as a Tibetan, I can't help admire their courage to be able to go to that extent, to be able to endure that level of pain, and to be able to take that kind of make that kind of ultimate sacrifice. The state of mind of this individual has to have arrived at a very, very difficult point. So all of this, pulls me in one direction. But on the other hand, I also feel conflicted because in a larger scheme of things, these activities really don't make much dent. And the cost is very high because individuals themselves lose their life. And if you look at the photographs of those who have committed self-immolations, most of them are very young. So that even makes the thought of their loss even more painful. Because imagine out of these individuals, if they had lived another 30 years or 40 years, what potential contribution they could have made. We never know. The future is open. So those things pull me in another direction. Now, turning them into heroes is where I have a problem. I really have a problem because we are then going into directions where certain freedom movements have gone, which glorify certain forms of activity, and I'm not quite sure that's the direction we as a community want to consciously go. And this is where I do have a problem. And I'll be very frank. Every time I go to Dharamsala, I do the Korah every morning when I'm there, because it's very beautiful, it's very good for my mind to be so beautiful in the morning, just going around His Holiness's residence. I come to the high-gearing point and I see that statue, and I feel conflicted. So this is where I may be being a little controversial here, but I think this is where we as a community of people who are engaged in a certain freedom movement really needs to ask ourselves, is that what we want? Is that the message we want to communicate to our younger generation? Are we really going in that direction of glorifying these kind of acts? We do have to admire, we do have to acknowledge, we do need to feel gratitude for the people who have given their lives, but then move it to a next level to turn them into heroes and glorify them. That is complicated. So that's my own feeling. So you may not share it, but that's where I am.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr.Jeshe Jinpa, for graciously answering all the questions in much depth. At the same time, I would also like to acknowledge the participation that's being shown by our participants. With that, we would like to move on to our tea break. And after tea break, we have the same roundtable group session, group discussion. You can either go back to your same group that you had earlier in the morning, or you can choose a group of your own liking and sit with that group. I would request one table to have only 10 participants so that all the participants could share their ideas and views, and each table to discuss only one question in depth, so that when you come back to present yourself, we're not touching on all the topics, all the questions, but one question each table. Thank you so much.